What if everything you know about saving a nation is wrong? What if the plan to rescue your country from economic ruin also quietly builds the very machine that will drag it into a world war? This isn't a conspiracy. This is the untold, deeply human calculus of a decade in crisis. We're going to look past the dates and the dust bowls to understand the real story of the Great Depression and the Second World War. It's a story not just about markets and militaries, but about impossible choices, unintended consequences, and the terrifyingly thin line between saving a country and changing it forever. Before we begin, this video is an educational and analytical discussion of 20th century geopolitical and economic history. It reflects analysis and opinion based on publicly available information and does not promote violence, hate, or extremist ideologies. I am not offering legal, financial, or political advice here. My goal is to understand the pressures and paradoxes that leaders and ordinary people faced in one of history's most pivotal decades. Let's set the stage not with the crash itself, but with the world it shattered. The late 1920s weren't just prosperous, they were psychologically potent. For many Americans, the modern age, with its cars, its radios, its soaring skyscrapers, felt like a permanent arrival. Wealth wasn't just being made, it was being spectacularized on the ticker tape of Wall Street. But this spectacle was built on a foundation of speculation, easy credit, and profound inequality. When the crash came in October 1929, it wasn't merely a financial correction. It was a total failure of that modern faith. 16 million shares were dumped in a panic on Black Thursday. The value of the market eventually fell by a catastrophic 85%. But the real damage was a paralysis of belief. Why spend? Why invest? Why hire if the fundamental engine of progress was revealed to be a mirage? This psychological freeze triggered a physical chain reaction. Banks, stuffed with bad loans and invested in now worthless stocks, began to fail. Over 9,000 would close. As they collapsed, they took with them the life savings of ordinary people, which in turn vaporized consumer demand. Factories shut down. By 1933, 1 in 4 American workers was unemployed. Industrial production had fallen by nearly half. And this wasn't contained. The United States was a global creditor. When its economy seized, it called in loans and stopped investing abroad. This sent shockwaves through the world economy, particularly hitting countries like Germany, which was deeply dependent on American capital. We often see the Great Depression as an American event, but it was instantly and tragically global. Worldwide trade would plummet by more than 50%. In this interconnected ruin, political extremism found its most fertile soil. In the United States, the initial response under President Herbert Hoover was, to put it mildly, constrained by ideology. He believed in limited government, in localism, in the economy's ability to self-correct. As breadlines formed in Hooverville, shanty towns of the destitute sprang up in city parks. This philosophy looked increasingly like a paralysis. The 1932 suppression of the bonus army, World War I veterans seeking early payment of their service benefits, cemented the image of a government out of touch and out of answers. The American people rendered their verdict in the 1932 election, handing a landslide victory to Franklin Delano Roosevelt. His promise was simple yet revolutionary, a New Deal. But here's where my analysis starts. This wasn't just a policy shift, it was a psychological and constitutional revolution. Roosevelt's core argument was that the federal government had not just the right, but the positive duty to act as the shield of the people and the pump primer of the economy. His famous first 100 days was a blizzard of activity designed to restore confidence. He declared a bank holiday to stop the bleeding of bank runs. He signed the Emergency Banking Act and later created the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, to guarantee savings. The message was clear: your money is safe, the government is here. But he also went much further. He created a constellation of new federal agencies, the alphabet soup of the New Deal. The Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, put young men to work in national forests. The Agricultural Adjustment Administration, AAA, paid farmers to reduce production and raise prices. The Works Progress Administration, WPA, became the nation's largest employer, building roads, bridges, schools, and even employing artists and writers. This was more than economic policy. It was the forging of a new social contract. For the first time, the federal government asserted a direct, ongoing responsibility for the economic welfare of its citizens. The Social Security Act of 1935, which provided pensions for the elderly and aid for the unemployed, cemented this idea. The state was now a permanent partner in the pursuit of security. Now we have to pause and ask a critical question, one that historians still debate fiercely. Did the New Deal actually end the Great Depression? The data here forces a nuanced answer. On one hand, it was a monumental political and social success. It restored hope. It put millions to work. It built vital national infrastructure we still use today. It saved capitalism, arguably, by reforming its most brutal excesses and giving people a stake in the system. But on a pure macroeconomic level, the recovery was halting and incomplete. Even by 1937, unemployment, while down from its peak, remained stubbornly high. Then in 1937, a sharp new recession hit, sometimes called the Roosevelt recession, driven in part by the administration's own attempt to cut back on spending and balance the budget. This was a painful lesson. It suggested the economy was not yet standing on its own. So if the New Deal's massive intervention didn't fully cure the economic illness, what did? This brings us to the most uncomfortable and consequential pivot in our story. The real end to the Great Depression in the United States came from a source entirely outside Franklin Roosevelt's domestic plans: the escalating drumbeat of war in Europe and Asia, and ultimately America's own entry into World War II. The war demanded total production. It absorbed every idle worker. It mobilized industry on an unimaginable scale. By 1941, the economy was not just recovered, it was overheating with martial purpose. This presents a deeply ironic conclusion. The crisis of democracy was ultimately resolved not purely by democratic reform, but by the furnace of global conflict. The New Deal stabilized the patient. The war sent him running a marathon. The Great Depression didn't just shape America's domestic policy, it crippled its foreign policy at the precise moment the world needed a steady hand. And understanding this requires us to look at the most powerful force in 1930s America. Not a president, not a market, but an overwhelming public desire for isolation. The memory of World War I was raw. Over 100,000 American deaths for a European war that many felt had solved nothing. A prevailing narrative took hold, fueled by Senator Gerald Nye's investigations, that bankers and arms merchants, merchants of death, had dragged America into the conflict. The conclusion for a nation now battling for its own economic survival seemed obvious. Never again. This sentiment crystallized into law with the Neutrality Acts passed between 1935 and 1937. These were extraordinary pieces of legislation. They were designed to legislate America out of future wars by removing the supposed causes of its last one. The acts prohibited the export of arms to any belligerent nation. They forbade American ships from carrying war materials. They warned Americans that traveling on belligerent ships was at their own risk. Think about the strategic mindset this reveals. It wasn't just non-intervention, it was a self-imposed quarantine. The goal was to make America inert, uninteresting to warring nations, and immune to the pull of foreign alliances. Congress, reflecting the public mood, wanted to tie the president's hands. And here's where we see Roosevelt's profound dilemma. Personally, he was an internationalist. He watched with growing alarm as Japan invaded Manchuria, as Mussolini attacked Ethiopia, and as Hitler began his systematic dismantling of the Versailles Treaty, rearming, remilitarizing the Rhineland. But politically, he was shackled. His entire political capital was spent on the New Deal. To challenge the Neutrality Acts head-on would have shattered his coalition and doomed his domestic agenda. He signed the first act in 1935, calling it an expression of the people's desire for peace, but he privately warned that no laws can be provided to cover every contingency. His solution was a masterclass in navigating a double bind. He would work within the constraints of isolationist law to subtly aid nations he saw as a democratic bulwark. The key was the 1937 revision, which introduced the cash and carry provision. It said belligerents could buy non-military goods, like oil, steel, and food, from the U.S., but they had to pay cash and transport it on their own ships. On the surface, this was pure cold capitalism. No loans, no risk to American vessels. But in reality, it was a geopolitical filter. Which nations had vast cash reserves, like gold, and a large merchant marine to come and get it? Britain and France. Which aggressive land-based power lacked these things? Nazi Germany. Cash and carry was neutrality in letter, but a lifeline in spirit. It was Roosevelt playing a weak hand with immense cleverness, trying to balance an unprepared nation's fears with a gathering storm's realities. The fragility of this balancing act was exposed in 1938 and 1939. The Munich Agreement, where Britain and France acquiesced to Hitler's annexation of the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia, was a shock. For many Americans, it confirmed the wisdom of staying out of Europe's corrupt and cowardly politics. Why die for Danzig? Why bail out the appeasers? But for Roosevelt and his advisors, Munich was a catastrophe. It revealed that the democratic powers were weak and that Hitler's ambitions were limitless. When Germany swallowed the rest of Czechoslovakia in March 1939, breaking the Munich Pact, Roosevelt made a direct appeal to Congress to revise the Neutrality Acts, specifically to repeal the arms embargo. He was rebuffed. The isolationist bloc in Congress was still too strong. The turning point was September 1st, 1939, the Nazi invasion of Poland. With war now officially raging, Roosevelt finally had the political air cover to act. In a fireside chat, he told Americans that when peace breaks anywhere, the peace of all countries is in danger. By November 1939, Congress had passed a new Neutrality Act, repealing the arms embargo and placing all trade with belligerents, including weapons, on a cash-and-carry basis. America could now legally sell Britain the tools of war. This escalated rapidly. With Britain running out of cash by 1941, Roosevelt devised the Lend-Lease Act. Framed as lending a garden hose to a neighbor whose house is on fire, it allowed the U.S. to lend war supplies to any nation vital to American defense, with payment deferred. The arsenal of democracy was open for business. The U.S. was now a non-combatant ally, a situation historian David Kennedy describes as all aid short of war. This created a bizarre and tense reality. The U.S. Navy was escorting convoys and clashing with German U-boats in the Atlantic in an undeclared naval war. American industry was humming, finally pulling the economy out of the Depression, but solely through war production. The nation was in a state of liminal conflict, economically and partially militarily at war, while politically and psychologically clinging to peace. All of this ambiguity was vaporized on December 7th, 1941. Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor was a tactical gamble to cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Strategically, it was a catastrophic blunder. It did the one thing Roosevelt's years of careful incremental pressure could not. It united the American people in a single furious instant for total war. The attack transformed the national psychology. The question was no longer, should we intervene? But how completely can we mobilize? Isolationism, as a potent political force, disappeared overnight. Congress declared war on Japan with only one dissenting vote. When Hitler, honoring his pact with Japan, foolishly declared war on the United States 4 days later, America's entry into the European war was sealed. The war economy that had been building now went to full throttle. The 6 million unemployed men of the Great Depression were absorbed into the military and defense plants. Women entered the industrial workforce on a massive scale. Rationing began for everything from gasoline to sugar. The Office of War Information replaced the New Deal's documentary photography units, shifting the narrative from domestic rescue to patriotic sacrifice. The Great Depression was over, not with a whimper, but with the thunder of total war. The New Deal state, with its experience mobilizing resources and managing large-scale programs, became perfectly suited to run a war economy. The government that built the Tennessee Valley Authority and the Works Progress Administration now knew how to build Liberty ships and manage nationwide rationing. So what are the broader implications of this decade-long arc from crash to global war? What does this tangled history tell us about nations in crisis? First, it reveals that economic catastrophe is a geopolitical event. The Depression didn't just cause poverty, it destabilized the entire international order. It created the vacuum that fascism filled. It weakened the democracies morally and financially, making confrontation seem impossible and appeasement logical. Second, it shows that domestic politics can create foreign policy paralysis. America's necessary, all-consuming focus on its own survival in the 1930s made it a passive spectator to the rise of existential threats. The tools needed to confront Hitler early, diplomatic will, economic pressure, military alliance, were all deemed politically toxic. A nation must first feel secure at home before it can project power abroad. But sometimes securing the home requires engaging with dangers that are already at the gate. Finally, and most importantly, this history underscores the law of unintended consequences. The New Deal, a profoundly domestic project aimed at human dignity, ultimately created the administrative capacity for global war. The isolationist laws designed to ensure peace may have emboldened aggressors who calculated that America would never fight. The war that finally ended the economic suffering inflicted a new, different kind of suffering on a global scale. Eras of great crisis forced societies to make foundational choices about the role of government, the balance of security and liberty, and their place in the world. The choices of the 1930s, the New Deal, the Neutrality Acts, were not made in a vacuum. They were desperate improvisations in the face of unprecedented collapse. Their legacy was a nation transformed, more powerful, more globally engaged, and burdened with the knowledge that total isolation is an illusion, and that security, both economic and physical, often comes at a price far greater than anyone intended to pay. Whether this sequence represents a tragic failure of foresight or the brutal, inevitable logic of a collapsing world order is a question that still hangs over us. It depends entirely on your reading of history. But one thing is certain. The road from the Dust Bowl to the beaches of Normandy was straight, narrow, and paved with the hardest choices a democracy can ever face. If you found this analysis of the tangled roots of war and the economic crisis useful, don't forget to subscribe, like, share, and hit the notification bell. Digging into these complex historical chains of cause and effect is what this channel is all about. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.